We're looking at Hasatan. Hasatan, the Satan or the adversary. We saw that in the Old Testament sometimes is used of man like one's enemies or adversary. And then it's also used of the angel of the Lord. So obviously the Lord isn't Satan. And with a small s, it just means adversary in Hebrew. But it's also applied to the adversary, the devil. We were looking at certain questions. One is the serpent to be equated with Satan? That was a rather lengthy discussion, and we saw that the enemy, Satan, used the serpent. And that the serpent that we see today isn't by any means what he was then. We don't know what he was then, but he was a wise creature that could speak. And Eve wasn't surprised that he was communicating to her on theological discussion. And that one of the reasons that Satan chose a serpent, or the serpent signifies Satan, is because the serpent is sly and speaks of his deceptive nature, how he charms things, and also his poisonous nature. Then according to the outline, under Satan, the spirit of evil. Now, anyone that studies the Old Testament will find that whatever happens under the Old Testament economy is under God's sovereignty. So you shouldn't be surprised. We're not dealing with the theological questions that you see in these passages. But the ones I'll give you, in every case, it says that God sent an evil spirit to trouble Saul, for example. So keep that in mind, that in the Old Testament, everything is under the sovereignty of God. But there are several passages that deal with the presence of evil spirits or demons besides those we've already dealt with. In addition to those several passages where demons were classified, you remember, as shadim and so forth, there are other passages that speak of evil spirits. And one is Judges 9:23, for example. We won't have to look at all of them, but this is an example. Judges 9:23. And this will be typical of the other passages that speak of it. 9:23, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. In other words, God is allowing an evil spirit to get in there to divide them. That's judgment against Abimelech. And you read the context, you'll see why. Then another passage is 1 Samuel 16, verses 14 to 16, where it is said God sent a troubling spirit against Saul because of his disobedience. We've looked at that before in other connections, so we'll pass on. Then a lying spirit is sent by God in 1 Kings 22:22. A lying spirit. Now, in these cases, as we've said, in the Old Testament, everything is subject to God's sovereignty. And, of course, they don't have full revelation besides that fact. But when you come to the New Testament, you find these evil spirits are said to be under the direct control of Satan and a part of his kingdom. And while we're studying Old Testament theology, you need to know that fact, that the full revelation shows that while God sometimes sends them as judgment and so forth, nevertheless, they are directly under the control of the devil. So evil spirits are mentioned. We're still under the subject of spiritism in the Old Testament. Now, another subject under this heading is Baal-zebub. Number C under Satan is Baal-zebub. We saw the serpent was Satan, that evil spirits are under the control of Satan, as you take the New Testament revelation. Then who is Baal-zebub in the Old Testament? Well, he's mentioned in 2 Kings 1:2, Baal-zebub. And it's supposed to mean, although there are various opinions, it's supposed to mean Lord of the Flies. You know these things that buzz around? Lord of the Flies. Let's see, 2 Kings 1:2. You might want to turn there, because here's the case where a king of Israel sent to Baal-zebub to get a revelation, find out if he's going to be healed. The king of Moab rebelled after the death of Ahab. And Ahaziah, now he's the new king of Israel, Ahaziah fell down through the lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria. And he was sick. He sent his messengers and said unto them, go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. Of course, you know the angel of the Lord told Elijah to go ask him, is it because there's not a God in Israel, you have to go to the heathen gods? Now this is the god of Ekron, which means he's a Philistine god. Ekron is one of the chief cities of the Philistines. Well, before we get to the New Testament, Beelzebub does occur more than once in the New Testament, so he's someone significant. Who is in the Old Testament? Well, this is the only mention of him, and since, by the way, his name is supposed to mean Lord of the Flies, archaeologists in excavating Philistine cities have uncovered golden images of flies. Now, the Philistines were good at this. If they had a disease like, well, in 1 Samuel 5 and 6, you remember when they captured the ark and God smote them with a pestilence? And the nature of the pestilence was such that they made images of it as a part of their appeasing the wrath of God. So these flies, these golden flies, not little tiny things that couldn't see, but probably considerable size, were excavated, and so no doubt either the fly, since Beelzebub's the lord of the flies, was worshipped as a god, since the heathen worship everything from snakes to crocodiles, literally, then it wouldn't seem strange to worship a fly. So either they worshiped the fly as God, or they made these images as a sort of appeasement, respected them, held them as sacred, a sort of an appeasement for the pestilences and plagues of flies that still are quite common in the Near East. I mean, you can still read stories today, or if you go over there, I mean, tents of the nomads will just literally swarm with flies. Or if a child has an infected ear or eye or a cut on the head, the flies will literally just stay there swarming. Of course, they get used to it, I guess. It's another thing to have a plague of flies. So that sometimes happened. Remember, the Lord sent gnats or insects in Egypt. That was one of the plagues. Well, you'd have to live under a net. Sometimes they do, but you can't work under a net and so on. So anyway, over in 1 Samuel 5 and 6, we do see where the Philistines captured the ark because Israel was out of line with God's will, so they lost the ark. And the Philistines thought they had the power of their God in their hands because they noticed that Israel won all of her battles with the ark going before. But verse 9 of chapter 5 of 1 Samuel was so that after they had carried it about, the ark, the hand of the Lord was against the city with a very great destruction, and he smote the men of the city, both small and great, and they had emerods in their secret parts. Well, NASV's tumors, others believe it's hemorrhoids. Whatever, it was bad because many died and it was a great plague. And then in chapter 6, verse 2, the Philistines called the priests and the diviners, saying, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us wherewith we shall send it." They want to get rid of it. And they said, "If you send away the ark of the Lord of Israel, send it not empty, but in any wise return him a trespass offering, that you may be healed, and it shall be known to you why his hand is not removed from you." And they said, "What shall the trespass offering be that we return to him?" They said, 5 golden emerods, or tumors, or hemorrhoids, or whatever version you're reading. You got anything any different? We really don't know what it was. Let's face it. But NASV says tumors, and I don't particularly think it was that, but it really doesn't matter. They made golden images of them, see, as an appeasement to God. And he actually did when they sent the ark back, not because they made images of their tumors or whatever, but because they sent the ark back, the plague lifted. So, who is Beelzebub? Over in the New Testament, he's called Beelzebub. The only difference is 2 E's instead of 2 A's. On your outline, you've got Baal, Baal. As people say, Baal, the god Baal, which means master or Lord. See, Baal was also a god worshipped in Canaan. And Zebub is supposed to mean flies, so Al-Zebub, Lord of the Flies. But in the New Testament, it's Beelzebub. In the King James, and I believe the New American, it's Beelzebul, if that helps any. Matthew 12:26, Jesus identifies Beelzebub with the kingdom of Satan. Beelzebub is identified with the kingdom of Satan in Matthew 12:26. In Mark 3:22, Jesus calls Beelzebub the prince of demons. So that would be Satan. Now here is where you have one of those instances, like I have mentioned on several occasions, that Jesus came into a context of developed theology between Malachi, the Old Testament, and Matthew. Well, let's just say between the two dispensations, which was 4 centuries. And he begins to teach about certain things, Hades and paradise and so forth, and doesn't give them a lot of instruction on it. Or really doesn't explain it, just expects them to understand, and they do. And so with Baal-zebub, between the Testament, he has come to be not just a god of the Philistines, but Satan himself. Now, why would that be? Well, we can only suggest. The point is, it is that way in the New Testament. That the Philistines were worshiping Satan directly, not just demons. We have already shown you that the Old Testament points out demons who were worshipped, but the Philistines were worshiping the god of Ekron, who was the devil, and this was his name. And then in 1 Corinthians 10:20, the Jews believed that all heathen deities were demons, all heathen gods were demons, according to 1 Corinthians 10:20. And then thirdly, since a king of Israel bypassed Yahweh, their God, and went to the Philistine god, then the implication is he was mighty important. In fact, they knew him to be the chief god of the heathen, or Satan. Not that they would say this is Satan, this is Hasatan, but they would know it's the chief god of the Philistines. So the very fact that a king of Israel would bypass the Lord and appeal to Baal-zebub meant that in the Jewish thinking he must be chief among the heathen, and so his name came to be the title in the New Testament, one of the titles, designations of the devil himself. Well, that's how you put it together, is what I'm saying. You've got him mentioned in 1 Kings, and then in the New Testament he's mentioned 2 or 3 times by the Lord himself, who calls him the devil and the prince of demons. So where did the transition come from, or when did it happen? And so many things like this happen between the Testaments. Again, why it's valuable, if you're a real student of the Bible and spiritual matters, to study the Apocrypha along with a good conservative author who helps you understand it, because the Apocrypha, while not inspired scripture, some of the books of the Apocrypha, especially the books of Maccabees, you'll find doctrines, some are right, some are not right, because it didn't inspire it. In other words, the Catholics got their idea of purgatory out of Maccabees. We're not suggesting you read it for that reason, but like everything else, the Jews developed in their theology between Malachi and Matthew, as we've said. And Jesus comes into a context where he points to the garbage dump, and he said that the person, who rejects him will end up in Gehenna. That's what he said. He didn't say hell. That's the English word. He said Gehenna, which simply means the valley of Hinnom is where the garbage dump was. It's still there right over the wall of Jerusalem. You can still see the valley of Gehenna. And he didn't explain that, but they knew that he was talking about eternal punishment. Like many things he doesn't explain. He comes into a context where already, you see, the Jews have developed a theology. Well, I believe, especially about the things that were right, of course, or only about the things that were right, God directed their theology. Why wouldn't he? That is their thinking. Helped them develop certain ideas by his Spirit, and then when Jesus, the apostles, came into that context, we don't have any explanations on what the meaning of paradise is. He just said to the thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. And he would say, well, I don't want to go to paradise, I want to go to heaven. But he knew what paradise meant. Amen. Want to be saved, want to be in the kingdom. But Jesus said paradise. And several things like this developed. So like Baal-zebub becomes Beelzebub or Beelzebul, and no explanation. All right, still looking under the heading Satan. The king of Babylon and the king of Tyre. What we have here are 2 remarkable passages in the Old Testament. Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, which conservatives have always believed have reference to Satan. 2 remarkable passages in the Old Testament that have figurative reference to Satan. And our study in Old Testament theology would not be complete without a rather close examination of these two passages. Now you have to arrive at some conclusion. I'll say right now the liberal church and the amillennials, which are today most churches, they don't believe there'll be a literal millennium and Israel has no restoration. They don't believe either one of these two passages refer to the devil or Satan. And so again, it's how much time you spend in the Word. When you spend enough time, then you come to see that certain things do speak. Not just of maybe the one they're directed to, like the king of Babylon, but it moves beyond him to speak of some supernatural being because the terminology and things said about him could not apply to a mere human being. So let's read Isaiah, and then we'll come back and look at it with reference to it not being limited to the king of Babylon. For the Lord will have mercy. Isaiah 14, keep in mind that when God says he will do something, it must be future. It's future to whoever said it anyway. So keep in mind we're moving out into the future. For the Lord shall have mercy, future, on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. Now that didn't happen until 1947, that little part right there. Set in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined to them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. And the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids, and they shall take them captives whose captives they were. Now that has certainly never happened. When Israel went into captivity in Babylon 586 BC, from that point she has been subject to somebody, without exception, till 1947 when she became a sovereign nation under the protest of everybody except people who knew prophecy. But to this hour, she's never taken them captive whose captives she were. She just about have to take the rest of the world. But one day she's going to do that. She's going to rule. Well, anyway, if God says it, it'll happen. And so he said, they'll take them captives whose captives they were. I'm just trying to show you this projected out into a place even beyond 47 and 1978. It hasn't happened. And they shall rule over their oppressors. Well, it's all they can do to hold their little nation together now. They're not ruling over any oppressor. It's all they can do to rule themselves. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall give them rest from thy sorrow. They don't have that yet. And from their fear. They don't have that yet. And from the hard bondage wherein they were made to serve. Thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. And of course people who are amillennials say, okay, that's the king of Babylon. It's already passed. Take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how has the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, speaking of Babylon, he that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Well, tell me when that ever happened. Yea, the fir trees rejoice in thee, and the cedars of Lebanon saying, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Sheol from beneath is moved for thee, to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones and all the kings of the nations. And they shall speak and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? They're really surprised that it happened. Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy vials. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. And how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? Now he's moving, verses 12 to 14, into an entirely another dimension. No way in the world could apply to mere man. How art thou fallen from heaven, O morning star? Literally morning star. Now the word Lucifer is a later translation. It's from the Latin, which means shining one. And there's a fellow out with a pamphlet now who's making Jesus Lucifer because he said God is light. Well, apparently he's never read 2 Corinthians 11. The devil appears as an angel of light too. And so you don't have to translate it Lucifer here. In fact, NASV, I imagine, has what? Morning star? Star of the morning? Well, same thing. They just wanted to stretch it out to make it sound better. It's Venus. Isn't Venus the morning star? You astronomers? All right. How art thou fallen from heaven, O shining one, son of the morning? How art thou cast down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, and as one commentator pointed out, I read a long time ago, there are 5 I wills here that fit Satan to a T. I will ascend into heaven. Now, how could Nebuchadnezzar say that? I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Why, he couldn't get up to Mount Everest because he didn't know it was there. I'll exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of congregation in the sides of the north. That song you sing, where God is in the sides of the north. I will ascend up above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. The 5 I wills of such a nature that it could only be said of a supernatural being, spiritual being. I will be like the Most High. What does Antichrist say in 2 Thessalonians 2? That's what he says. Yet thou shalt be brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. We'll see in a moment that the verses, like in Matthew 24, where Jesus prophesies about the future, he moves back and forth, you see. He's talking about one person one time, another time, and that's the nature of some prophecy. Anyway, so we'll see he's moved back in verse 15 and following to Antichrist, but we'll show you that in a moment. You'll be brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee. Consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble and did shake the kingdoms, which is what Antichrist will do, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, and opened not the house of his prisoners? All the kings of the nations, even all of them, lie in glory, every one in his own house, but thou art cast down out of the grave like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stories of the pit. Ezekiel says sides of the pit. Stories of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. Now, there are 3 main views of Isaiah 14 as well as Ezekiel 28, so we'll just include them together as far as the views. And the first view of Isaiah 14, so I say it'll also apply to Ezekiel. Isaiah 14 is that this passage refers to the historical king of Babylon alone. The passage refers to the literal king of Babylon. Second view, it refers to Satan alone, who is addressed as the king of Babylon. And the third view, which I believe is the right one, and if you make a diligent study of this, you'll find conservative and premillennial scholars hold to the third view, that the passage refers both to Antichrist and to Satan, and not to the king of Babylon at all. And this is seen for many considerations that, first of all, the passage is primarily prophetic. The whole passage is prophetic. That doesn't mean it couldn't apply to a future king of Babylon within Isaiah's lifetime or whatever, or under Old Testament economy, but nevertheless it's prophetic. The future tenses we've already shown you. And this view holds that it's addressed to the future king of the final Babylon, who is Antichrist. The future king of the final Babylon, who is Antichrist. And then in verses 12 to 14, the language moves beyond Antichrist and applies directly to Satan himself, by whose power and authority Antichrist reigns and rules. And then verses 15 and following returns back to the future king of Babylon, Antichrist. Now, before anyone would pass any judgment on whether that's a correct view or a good view, you need to do a lot of study of the book of Daniel, book of Ezekiel, book of Revelation, New Testament, Gospel of Matthew, so many places. And so there's no way to bring all that together in one teaching, and so we've taught many things about those other subjects, book of Zechariah, Antichrist is mentioned in many passages. So we just give you what the view is, and then you can do your own study. Now, let's look at some indications that this view is valid. First of all, the passage is prophetic and refers to the future day of Israel's rest and triumph over her oppressors, which has never happened, so it couldn't have been fulfilled yet. That the passage is prophetic, referring to the future day of Israel's rest and her rule over her enemies. Verse 3, and it shall come to pass in that day, he's already in 2 verses giving you future tenses, it shall come to pass in that day, the Lord will give them rest. Israel has never had rest. She doesn't even have it now. She knows nothing but unrest from her enemies. She's right in the middle of it. It's a good time to be talking about it. We don't have to labor that point, that she has not known rest, and when has she ever ruled over her oppressors? She's doing all she can to keep alive from her oppressors. Well, we're saying that whatever you do with the passage, it's prophetic in future. It has never been fulfilled. No way. Verses 1 to 4 prove that. And then the Bible clearly teaches a Babylon yet to come. Future. Out there in the future. And its ruler will be Antichrist. The Bible teaches a Babylon yet to come. The 2 Babylons in Revelation, remember? Chapter 17 and 18. Antichrist will rule over the future kingdom. Revelation 13, Revelation 17. And when Antichrist comes, Revelation 13:4 shows us he will be supported and empowered by Satan himself. Revelation 13. And then there are several passages where Satan is addressed through others that he influences and possesses. Several passages where Satan himself is addressed through others that he has influenced or possessed. Like in Genesis 3, God addresses Satan through the serpent. Matthew 16, 22, 23, he addresses Satan through Peter. He didn't say to Peter, get thee behind me, but get thee behind me, Satan. And he looked right at Peter, right in the eye when he said it. In John 13, 27, he addresses Satan through Judas. We're told in John 13, 27, Satan entered Judas. And as soon as he did, the Lord turned to Judas and said, what thou doest, do quickly. He was talking to the devil. Yeah. But you see, the devil has possessed or influenced persons that are addressed. The point is that the language of Isaiah 14 can't be limited to a mere man. And so God is addressing Satan through the figure of the king of Babylon, or in this case, Antichrist himself, who is the future king of Babylon. The language of Isaiah 14, we're saying, cannot be limited to a mere human being who is addressed, but he's actually talking to Satan, Has-Satan. Now, as we turn over to Ezekiel 28, it will become even more clear, this other rather remarkable passage, Ezekiel 28, there's no way this language in the whole passage, that is, several verses of this passage, can be limited to a mere human being. And this is Ezekiel 28, 1 to 19. The word of the Lord came again to me, saying, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre. So here it's addressed to the king of Tyre, like the other was addressed to the king of Babylon, but it's going to move beyond him. Thus saith the Lord God, because thy heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a God. Well, if we didn't have anything but that, I doubt that a mere king would say that. I am a God, I sit in the seat of God, in the midst of the seas, yet thou art a man and not God, though thou set thine heart as the heart of God. In 2 Thessalonians 2, Antichrist says exactly that. I am God, he sits on the seat of God, the throne of God, and he receives worship as God. And Paul said that man of sin has to be revealed. He said, before the Lord returns. He says, don't let anyone deceive you. The Lord will not return till the man of sin is revealed. Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that can be hid from thee. I don't think he would say that about the king of Tyre. Who's king of Tyre? You'd have to look hard and long in any library to find out who he was. So we're dealing with these two passages because they're addressed to someone that the church has believed to be Satan. Not today's church, of course, for the most part. With thy wisdom and with thine understanding thou hast gotten thee riches, and gotten gold and silver into thy treasuries. By thy great wisdom, by thy traffic hast thou increased thy riches, and thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Now keep in mind that some of the imagery will apply to an earthly figure, and not directly to either Antichrist or Satan, except this is what will happen when Antichrist comes on the scene. He will multiply things to himself. He'll control all economy and all riches and all the banks. We're getting a World Bank, United Nations, and one world religion under Catholicism, under the Pope, and all Antichrist has to do is move into that. He'll control all this. Behold, therefore, I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile thy brightness. They shall bring thee down to the pit, and thou shalt die the deaths of them that are slain in the midst of the seas. Wilt thou yet say before him that slayeth thee, I am a God, or I am God? I mean, a person who's about to have his throat cut isn't going to say he's God, is he? God's making light of it. Will you yet say before him that slayeth thee, I am God? But thou shalt be a man, and no God, in the hand of him that slayeth thee. Thou shalt die the deaths of the uncircumcised by the hand of strangers, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord God. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up this lamentation against the king of Tyre, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God. And here's where we move completely beyond man, king of Tyre, Antichrist, or anybody, and move into the realm of the supernatural. Notice what's said. Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was I covering, the sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, the carbuncle, gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets is vocal cords, and of thy pipes was prepared in thee the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth. And I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. That is God's very presence. He says he's going to cast him out. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground, to the earth. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. Thou hast defiled the sanctuary by the multitude of thine iniquities, by the iniquity of thy traffic. Therefore will I bring forth a fire from the midst of thee. It shall devour thee, and I will bring thee to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold thee. All they that know thee among the people shall be astonished at thee. Thou shalt be a terror, and never shalt thou be any more. Well, rather than a long detailed commentary, I'm going to refer you to my book, Old Testament Prophets, because I deal with that whole passage here, and I'm just going to take the time to discuss it from the 2 pages where I do here. It's only about a page and a half. So if you don't have the book, it'll be on this tape. If you do get the book, you'll have it both ways. So the author says, page 307, Introduction to Old Testament Prophets, observe the extraordinary nature of the description in Ezekiel 28:11-19. So I deal with the verses. You can kind of look at your Bible. Thou sealest up the sum, God says of him. First of all, verse 12, thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, 28:12. Now that is, he's saying to him, you are complete and perfect in these aspects. Now, how could that be said of a man? To seal up the sum, you know what the sum of anything is? Addition, 2 and 2 is 4, 10, 10, 20, 7, 7, 14, 3 7s, 21. Addition. He said, you seal up the sum. You're the perfect numbers, what he's saying. You are perfect and complete as far as wisdom and beauty are concerned. Well, no man, not even a Hollywood idol would anyone be able to say that of him. Because if he's a male, he looks just as ugly of a morning as anybody that isn't a Hollywood idol. He has to shave the stubble off and get his hair combed and brush his teeth and get the sleep out of his eyes and take a bath. And we won't discuss how the ladies look after they get married. Of a morning, I mean. Curlers. Well, I've already put the men in their place so they couldn't get offended. I'm just saying it wouldn't be said of us. Okay, let's don't anybody bog down and... Praise the Lord. It wouldn't be said of us that we are perfect in wisdom and beauty. We would all agree. You can scratch all that other if that bothered you. Thou wast in Eden, the garden of God, verse 13. Now how could the king of Tyre be there? And by the way, this isn't Adam and Eve's Eden, because he goes on to tell us it's God's holy mountain, verse 14. You were in the Eden of God, not the Eden of Adam, but the garden of God, the holy mountain of God, where we're told he was covered with every imaginable kind of splendor. Every precious stone was thy covering. Now, if he'd have said something like that and left out you were in the holy mountain with God, then we could say, well, the king of Tyre was rich, and so he could have had a crown of jewels, and that's what he refers to, and rings on his fingers, and bracelets and all of that. But he said, you were covered with every imaginable kind of splendor in the garden of God. And then he said, this is the third thing, in the day that thou wast created, verse 13. Now twice he's referred to as having been created. It said again in verse 15, he was created, which is certainly inappropriate when applied to the king of Tyre. The scriptures speak only of Adam being created. From that moment on, all of his descendants are said to be born. Now that's obvious even if we didn't tell you. But this one, God said he was created. Now, if he's a spiritual being, then God did create them, as the scriptures say, and that would make more sense. The day you were created. And then in verse 14, fourthly, thou art the anointed cherub. Thou wast the anointed cherub that covereth. And he's not talking about a figure on an ark in the temple, but this person, and how could it be said of the king of Tyre, was covering God's throne in heaven. That's how close he was to God. See, God was showing that in the ark. And then people who study Scripture see here it is again in Ezekiel of a living being. It said that his office and function was that of what he depicted in figure on the Ark of the Covenant. And as the author points out, no amount of spiritualizing has been able to deal satisfactorily with the designation cherub outside of its application to a spiritual being. The cherubim in Scripture always appear in the closest relationship with God, bearing the divine throne when he manifests himself in his glory. Now Ezekiel 1 shows us that. We're in 28 here. Ezekiel 1, Psalm 18. And they appear as guardians of the inaccessibility of his holy presence. Exodus 25:20, 1 Chronicles 28:18, Genesis 3:24. In what sense could such a designation characterize the king of Tyre even symbolically? He is called the anointed cherub that covereth, set apart for special responsibility, as the following statements indicate. And the following statement is this: God says, I set thee, so that thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Verse 14, anointed by God himself, we're told here, to position at his eternal throne. The holy mountain, of course, signifies the center of God's government. And that is seen in other passages like Joel 3:17, Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah chapter 14 speaks of the holy mountain of God, which speaks of the center of his divine rule and government. Well, whoever this is, and certainly the king of Tyre isn't in the center of his divine rule. There, he said, I set you there. Then he said, thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 14. doubtless signifying the divine presence of God in His glory, around whose feet Ezekiel in chapter 1 saw, the appearance of fire. And as Moses earlier said, under his feet, as it were, I saw a paved work of sapphire stone, and the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire. Exodus 24. God often appears in the fire. But right in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, in that great vision, He appears in the fire. And so He said, the anointed cherub, you walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. That doesn't speak too much of the ability of a human. Thou wast perfect. And this, of course, thou wast perfect in all thy ways from the day that thou wast created until unrighteousness was found in thee. Verse 15. Perfect in all of your ways. Perfect in all of your ways. Certainly unsuitable and inappropriate when applied to the king of Tyre, who was neither originally perfect nor created, and later falling from his previous state of righteousness. This, however, is an accurate description of the career of Satan. And we give you some comparisons here where in the New Testament it said that he fell and he was discovered to be a liar and a murderer and so forth, which is precisely, by the way, what Isaiah 14 says, that he said he would ascend up and God cast him down. And then another reference, thy heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. In other words, he made a fool out of himself over his beauty. The most beautiful creature in God's universe, no doubt. Standing at the throne of God, protecting, shadowing with his wings. One of the cherubim, and probably the leading cherubim. Of all the spiritual creatures God created, this one, not even an angel, had his rights and privileges. But he was so beautiful. Well, there's no way to describe it, because in the spiritual dimension, there's nothing really to measure the most beautiful person you would see on earth by. Of all of the beautiful creatures, he was the most beautiful. But he said, you've corrupted your wisdom. You were also the wisest, but when you started to get proud of your beauty, then your wisdom became corrupted. And that's precisely, you see, what's said of Satan in 1 Timothy 3:6, that he fell into condemnation because of pride. And we're warned not to fall into Satan's condemnation. He fell because of pride. 1 Timothy 3:6. And of course, that's what Satan is saying in Isaiah, I will do this, I'll become as God. He corrupted his wisdom because of his beauty. And then God says, therefore have I cast thee out as profane out of the mountain of God. I have destroyed thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. I have cast thee to the earth, and I have turned thee to ashes, and thou shalt never more have any being. Precisely the fate depicted for Satan in many passages, like Revelation 12:7-9, Revelation 20, verse 10, and even Isaiah 14. So the prophet Ezekiel says the same thing as the New Testament. The time's coming when God will cast Satan down, and he will never more have any being. That doesn't mean he ceases to exist, but he'll never have any more being as far as God's creation is concerned, because we're told he'll be tormented forever in the lake of fire. Two remarkable passages which I suggest you study. All right, we come to the last part of the spirit world in Old Testament thought. And so that is the angel of the Lord. Let's write that up here for you in Hebrew, because a lot of you are always saying you want that. It's in Hebrew, the Malak Yahweh. And of course, transliterated, it's M-A-L-A-K, Malak, M-A-L-A-K, Y-H-V-H, Yahweh. Now, as astounding as it may seem, there are over 200 designations of Messiah in the Bible, titles and so forth, and this is one of the most often used. There are over 200 besides this. Because this is one of the most profound, we'll look at it in a little detail. So if you turn first of all to Zechariah, the Old Testament prophet Zechariah, Here we'll notice how the angel of the Lord appears sometimes in a context where you'd have to study it to see he's there. In other places, it's clearly said he's the angel of the Lord. And here is a case where we have the first vision of the man on the red horse. Chapter 1. But he saw, verse 8, in the night, and behold, a man riding upon a red horse. Now that's a man on a red horse, you see. And he stood among the myrtle trees that were in the bottom, and behind him were red horses speckled and white. And then said I, O my Lord, that's Adoni, the title to someone that isn't deity, O my Lord, what are these? And the angel that talked with me said unto me, I will show thee what these are. And the man that stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are they whom the Lord hath sent to walk to and fro on the earth. And they answered the angel of the Lord that stood among the myrtle trees, and said, We have walked to and fro in the earth, and behold, all the earth sitteth still and is at rest. Now his vision is he sees a man on a red horse. He asks the interpreting angel, if you remember the teaching in Zechariah, the angel who talked with me is the interpreting angel. What does this mean? What's the vision signify? The angel said, I'll tell you, but the one who tells him is the man on the red horse. And he explains it, these are they that are walking throughout the earth. In other words, he sent them forth in ministry. These other horses. The man on the red horse says that. And then the people have come back, the horses that he sent forth, and they report to the man on the red horse, who's now called the angel of the Lord, Malach Yahweh. Verse 8, I saw a man riding on a red horse. He stood among the myrtle trees. Verse 11, and they answered the angel of the Lord that stood among the myrtle trees. And the answer came, verse 10, from the man on the red horse. I'm just showing you that to show you how the angel of the Lord appears in many, many passages in the Old Testament. The question is, who is it? Well, that's what we'll see tonight. A careful study of the passages where Malach Yahweh appears, angel of the Lord, reveals it's not an ordinary angel, but deity. In fact, it's the pre-incarnate Christ, who is the Malach Yahweh. It's the pre-incarnate Christ. Now, that's one occurrence. We'll look at several others, and we won't look at all of them. I'll give you all of them that I feel are significant, but we'll look at several to show you this. He appeared to Hagar way back in the time of Abraham, the Malach Yahweh. Keep in mind, this is deity, because the passages show that. This is not just an ordinary angel. Genesis 16, verses 9 to 13. Way back in Genesis. Genesis 16, 9 to 13. She has fled from Sarah because, you know, she's become Abraham's concubine. Sarah was barren, and then she began to mock Sarah because she became pregnant. So Sarah cast her out. And verse 9, she's wandering about in the desert. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself to her hands. By the way, there's submission taught. She was in being submissive. The angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, and it shall not be numbered for multitude. And of course she bears Ishmael, we know later, and he becomes the father of the Arabians. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. And she called the name of Yahweh. You see, you don't get that in English, but this is deity. She didn't say the Lord small l. That's why you've got a capital L in your versions. She called the name of the Lord that spoke to her. In other words, she called Yahweh who spoke to her, Thou God seest me. For she said, I have also looked after him that seeth me. In other words, here she calls him God. And there twice it said he's the angel of the Lord. But she calls him God. And then he appears again as a man to Abraham in Genesis 18, 1 to 3. These are very early appearances of the angel of the Lord. He appears as a man in Genesis 18, but in Genesis 19 we see they're angels. that is called angels and men, both. And Yahweh appeared unto Abraham by Mamre, the oaks of Mamre, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood over against him. Now see, it says it's Yahweh who appeared to him, but he sees 3 men, and one of them is Yahweh. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them before the tent of the door and bowed himself to the earth and said, My Lord. And it's the word for deity. You remember we told you that Lord is translated 2 ways in the Old Testament. It's a term of respect, and it's Adoni. And always, when it's God, it's Adonai. And this is Adonai. There's only one exception I know to that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and the exception, the context shows it's God anyway. So we won't take the one exception. But he uses the term Adonai for the Lord, for deity. But it's already said that it was Yahweh who appeared to him. And again, the angel who spoke to Abraham at the time he sacrificed Isaac is said to be God. The angel who spoke to Abraham when he sacrificed Isaac calls himself God. That's Genesis 21, 11, 12, and 18. Genesis 21, 11, 12, and 18. Then the angel of the Lord who called down fire and brimstone in Genesis 19 is called the Lord. The angel who called down fire and brimstone is called the Lord. The Lord called down fire from the Lord. So you've got the Father in heaven, the Son on earth, in his pre-incarnate state. Then he appears to Jacob as the angel of the Lord. And he identified himself in Genesis 31, not as an ordinary angel, but he says, I am the God of Bethel. He's an angel, but he says, I am the God of Bethel. And if you go all through the Old Testament references to the angel of the Lord, and occasionally called the angel of God, Malach Ha-Elohim, you see it's deity, because he receives worship and so forth, and calls himself God. That was Genesis 31. Then the angel that Jacob wrestled with, in Genesis 32, he said, after he wrestled with this angel, I have seen God face to face. Now, we could spend a lot of time looking up each passage, but I think you can do that for whatever interest you've got in looking to see how often the pre-incarnate Christ, or God himself, appears in the Old Testament in the form of an angel and occasionally as a man. But he'll be called a man in one verse and the angel in the next. They just thought it was a man. Then they saw it was an angel. Then they saw it was God. So you get all 3 in some passages. And then the Malach Yahweh appeared to Moses in the burning bush. And he's called the Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord. And that angel said, I am God. I mean, it couldn't be any clearer that the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is God. In Exodus 3, he said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then of the angel in the wilderness days, there was an angel God said he was going to send before Israel in the days of their wanderings. Of that angel, God could say of him, my name is in him. Now, he never said that about any angel but one in the Old Testament. That's Exodus 23, 20, 21. I'd like for you to look at that one because it's significant. Of course, they're all significant, like Exodus 3 in the burning bush. But here's one that you're not as familiar with. Exodus 23, 20, 21. Behold, I send an angel before thee. Now, see, they're not in the promised land yet. They're wandering. I send an angel before thee to keep thee by the way, to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Take ye heed before him, and hearken unto his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not forgive your transgression, for my name is in him. Now, the reason we know that is no ordinary angel is because, first of all, they're commanded to obey him, the angel, and not God. But, of course, this is God. To obey the angel. And secondly, God said they are to abstain from provoking this angel to anger because he has the power to forgive or withhold forgiveness. Now, no angel can do that. Even though some priests think they can, angels can't even do that. And then the third thing, Not only does he have the power to forgive sins, as Son of God said he did in Mark 2, the presence of God is in this angel. And for those of you who are interested in the Hebrew aspect, it's not the term generally used bo, the preposition bo, it's not bo, in him. Well, without giving you the other, the vowel pointing is a little too complicated, but it's the word for within. See, ordinarily the Hebrew would say, my name is in him, but God is saying, my name is within his inward parts. He used a very unusual expression. If you need it, it's bekerebo. That's not a big thing. It's just another thing. If you're reading the Hebrew, it's saying more than bo. He didn't say, my name's on him or with him. You see, be can be on, with, by, beside. I'm with him. My name is with him. That isn't what God said. He said, my name is within his innermost parts. Kereb, the center, inwardly. And then the angel in the pillar of fire and the cloud that was with Israel in her wanderings is called the Malach Yahweh. He was in the cloud and pillar of fire. That was the angel. It looked like a cloud and fire, but that was the angel. That's God's presence. That's what it's called. You read those passages. Exodus 13 and 14. Exodus 13:21, Exodus 14:19. I mean, God wasn't just putting some fire up there to scare off the Egyptians or a cloud to guide them. That was his presence, because often he appeared in the tabernacle as a cloud. We read the cloud came down and God spoke out of the cloud. See, he doesn't have any form or shape in his pre-incarnate state, so he can appear as a man, an angel, cloud, fire, or in Ezekiel's vision. There's no way to draw that. Now he appears again as a man in a passage in Joshua 5. The Malach Yahweh is given a little bit different title here. Here he's called the captain of the hosts of the Lord. But it's deity. It's Joshua 5, 13 and 14. They're ready to cross the Jordan and take Jericho. And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and said, art thou for us or for our adversaries? Oh, Joshua, he was a warrior. Remember, he was Moses' general. And when Moses dies, then he takes over leading Israel. In fact, Moses was not a general, he was a leader. He was a spiritual leader. Joshua is a fighting man. Moses sinned with his lips, and God said he couldn't go into the promised land, but it still wasn't God's plan that he should. So he had to step aside so Joshua the warrior could go in. So he's ready to attack anyone he sees with a sword. Are you for us or against us? But after he gets a reply, watch what he does. He said, nay, but as the captain of the hosts of the Lord am I now come. Literally said, I'm the prince. I'm the prince of the hosts of Yahweh. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship. And he said, what saith my Lord unto his servant? Now you know enough scripture that he wouldn't worship an angel. And the captain of the Lord's hosts said unto Joshua, loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Amen. You remember someplace else where that was said, to loose the sandal from off thy foot? Where? The burning bush. And the angel of the Lord in that bush said, I'm God. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Said that to Moses. It's the only place, where that's said. Well, that ground around Jericho wasn't holy. That's why they were destroying the city. That was very unholy ground. That's why God was destroying it. So the significance is the same God back there in the bush is now saying to Moses' successor, I'm that same God. Where that man with his drawn sword was standing, it was holy because this was God, pre-incarnate Christ. I mean, Joshua wasn't afraid of him until he found out who he was. Because sword didn't mean a thing to Joshua, because he was that type man. That's why God was using him. So that's one reason we know that this man, who calls himself, by the way, Sar Tzava Yahweh, which is Prince of the Hosts of Yahweh, translated in some versions captain, but literally said he's a prince. You know who the prince is. Not only because he said the ground's holy, but Joshua worshipped him. That's another reason why we know it's a deity. And then what he says also reveals that. What he says concerning why he's come. Back in Exodus 23 and Exodus 33, God promised the Israelites he would send his angel before them when they got ready to go into the promised land to deliver the Canaanites, Amorites, and so forth in their hands. That's back in Exodus 23 and 33. God said, when you're ready to go in, I'll send my angel before you. And of course, he's the one that fought the battles. Remember, Israel didn't take Jericho. Supernatural intervention. That angel caused the walls to fall down. He says, as the captain of the hosts of Yahweh, I am now come. You see, he'd been promised. He's saying, I'm here. That's what the now signifies. In my research, I discovered the early church agreed with this view that these various appearances is the pre-incarnate Christ. Clement in the 2nd century. You know, he was right after the apostles. Clement in the 2nd century. Which name is familiar to all of you that study church history here. Here's what he said. To him, meaning this angel, meaning Christ, to him did Moses bear witness when he said, the Lord received fire from the Lord and rained it down. Remember Genesis 19? This is back 2nd century, right after the apostles. He's making the same connections. Him did Jacob see as a man and said, I have seen God face to face, and my soul is preserved. Him did Abraham entertain and acknowledged him to be the judge and his Lord. Him did Moses see in the bush. Him did Joshua the son of Nun see as the captain of the Lord's hosts for assistance against Jericho. These men are really disciples of the apostles, some of them. Not that you have to take what they say about everything. I trust we don't have to say things like that too often, but it does give you some insight to what the early church believed. For example, the early church and right after were premillennial. They were chiliastic. They believed in the millennium. And then the church became amillennial. Senior Augustine started that. Augustine, whom the Catholics love to claim. And so the Catholics and all Protestants come out of Catholicism, so they've become amillennial. It means they don't believe in a millennium. So there are a lot of things you learn by studying early church history that God is restoring in this hour. I get blessed when I read things like this in Baker's book, Visions Beyond the Veil, where those children had all those visions and revelations and anointings and cast out demons, little toddlers. And I think it's in that book where one was given revelations of the book of Revelation. Didn't know anything about the book of Revelation. I don't even know if they could read. And it lined up with premillennial interpretation of the book of Revelation. That is to be taken literally. There will be a literal reign and rule on earth and so forth. If I didn't read it there, I read it somewhere. In fact, it's interesting. I do remember a colored brother in Africa, when he got saved and baptized in the Spirit, had visions concerning the millennium and how it lines up with the premillennial interpretation of the Bible, that there is to be a literal reign and rule of Christ on earth. Well, no one could read the Bible, really, and come up with any other conclusion. See, the early church was chiliastic, which is the term they used, because the Bible teaches it. The word, means 1,000 and representative of those who believe in the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. Now, other theophanies, we'll just give you the passages without looking them up, where Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, appears numerous times. He appeared to Israel in Judges 2, Israel at Bochim, Judges 2. He appeared to Gideon, Judges 6. He appeared to the parents of Samson, announcing his birth, Judges 13. He appeared to Israel when God sent that great pestilence as a result of David's sin of numbering Israel in 2 Samuel 24. And now that you know this, as you read the passages in the Old Testament, they'll take on new significance. Not just an angel, but the Lord himself. Like Elijah's flight is another one when he was fleeing from Jezebel. Now you go back and read it, and if you can read Hebrew, even better, and look who that angel is. It's the Malach Yahweh. See, no ordinary angel is ever called Malach Yahweh, only deity, and he receives worship. That's 1 Kings 19. And then there are mentions of him in Malachi 3:1 as the messenger, the angel of the covenant. And he's mentioned by David in Psalm 34:7 as the deliverer of those who fear him. And I think we can say without fear of contradiction that most people don't realize that God just many, many times, we could almost say repeatedly, manifested his presence to his people visibly in the Old Testament. You know, it's like, well, we've got all the revelation, but they had the direct revelation of God constantly in their midst because he was enthroned on the ark, as we'll get to later in the temple. That was his throne. He literally dwelt there, his presence. Now, of course, we always add, for the sake of those maybe haven't heard all the other teaching, he's everywhere at the same time, too. We take him at what he said. He said, there's where my presence will be, on that throne, which we call the ark, but it was really his throne. So students of the Bible have generally concluded that the Malach Yahweh in the Old Testament is deity, a theophany, a temporary manifestation of the pre-incarnate Christ in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord. In the New Testament, after the incarnation, however, after the incarnation, the angels are never Malach Yahweh. They're always ordinary angels. We're told who they are sometimes: Gabriel, Michael. The angel of the Lord is prior to his incarnation. After that, Jesus appears himself, as himself, not as an angel. That is when he does appear, like he appeared to Paul, you see, not as an angel, but as the Lord. He saw the Lord. That is Jesus of Nazareth. Glorified body. Not a temporary manifestation. See, the angel of the Lord is a temporary manifestation as a man or as a captain of the host of the Lord or as an angel. But after the incarnation, it's always an appearance of Jesus of Nazareth. Now that finishes our study of spirit, world, and Old Testament thought. Well, his statement that one conservative writer says the appearance in Daniel where his three friends in the fiery furnace was not pre-incarnate appearance where there's an angel. Remember, Daniel said, I saw one like the Son of Man. And he says, this author says, that it probably isn't. That's no big thing because he's as conservative as you can be. That would not be a critical statement of his. And there are reliable teachers and scholars on both sides of the fence. Who is that in the furnace? Is that an angel? Is it pre-incarnate Christ?
He said that all the pointings were such that it was like,
Yeah.
Adonai and Adonai.
Which doesn't mean a lot because it's Adonai there when Joshua fell down and worshiped the man. And that's the exception, the only one I recall offhand. Joshua said, what does my Lord want, or something? And it's Adonai, which is a title of respect, but he falls down and worships him and obeys him to take his shoe off and all. So you can't always make everything turn on a vowel point. Very, very rarely would you find any time in the Old Testament when of the Lord it's said anything but Adonai. which is titled for deity. But remember what situation he's in. He's falling down worshiping, but he thought he saw a man. He rushed up to him with his sword. He was going to do battle. That's what he said, and we'll just leave it at that. Because the other evidence outweighs there in that passage, Joshua 5, that it is deity, for all the reasons we gave you. Back to the question, though, you ask me, whom say ye that he is? Well, I'm going to give you my opinion because I believe I would have remembered it having translated the passage in graduate school in Aramaic. I would have remembered if I had a different opinion. And I'll stay with the idea until you can prove, or until it is proven otherwise. That's a manifestation of deity. But see, it wouldn't matter one way or another because it's the Lord sending someone to deliver them. I don't think it's a big thing whether that's the pre-incarnate Christ in Daniel. Who is the person? Is it deity or an ordinary angel? There's no way to tell in that passage. There's no way to tell. But the one in Joshua I use because the evidence is all on the side of that is deity. Now, we could settle the matter in Daniel if the three would have fallen down and worshipped this one that delivered them. But as I say, that's no problem. It's still God delivering them. The miracle is there. And that wasn't the question anyway. It's just who is it? But I'd have to read what Payne said. He's quite reliable and he may have a point. All right, Lord bless.